3, 2, 1, and we are live with our first webinar in a long time. This is European Coalition for Israel. My name is Thomas Sandell, and today we will be discussing the significance and the relevance of the First Zionist Congress 125 years ago this weekend. And with me in this conversation, we have Philip Steele from Poland, an American/Polish historian who have written extensively about Theodor Herzl, also about Christian Zionism and a number of other subjects related to Poland. It's good to have you here, Philip, if I may call you Philip today. John Desser from United States. I think you are in outside of Washington, D.C. at the moment. Great grandson of Mordechai Ben Ami, personality that we will learn more about during the course of this webinar. John has a long and successful career on Capitol Hill. He's been working for the late Senator John McCain and was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health Policy under George W. Bush. Good to have you with us, John, and Dr. Grégory Lafitte, our Director for UN Affairs of the European Coalition for Israel and the co-founder of Forum for Cultural Diplomacy. Before we start, let me, as a host, express our condolences to you, John. You lost your mother just a few days ago, the granddaughter of Mordechai Ben Ami, and how appropriate in a way to honor her life and legacy by having this conversation today. So our thoughts and prayers are with you, John.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you.
But let us jump into the subject, and let me also say that we are looking at probably a conversation about 45 minutes. There is no stop time, so if there is a good flow, we may take an extra few minutes. But looking at the theme of our webinar, the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. My question, and this is primarily for Philip and Grégory, who have studied the subject extensively, was this the big bang of the Zionist movement? Well, was it like this, that all of a sudden there were some 100 Jewish leaders from across Europe who decided, let's go to Basel and let's create a Jewish state? Or what is the context? What is the background? And if we start with you, Philip.
You can hear me now, I hope. I think it's appropriate, yeah, altogether appropriate to talk about a big bang. The mythology regarding Herzl is that of parthenogenesis, that it all began with him. And in fact, it didn't, but he was able to raise the cause and place it in the spotlights like none of the Zionist leaders before him. Herzl, one of the important historians of Zionism, famously stated that Zionism was twice born. I think it's more appropriate to think of it as thrice born. After the debacle regarding Uganda and the breakdown there, the unwillingness of the Sultan to allow Jewish colonization, the unwillingness of the Tsar to allow the Russians there to leave. Once again, the movement that had begun with Herzl faded out, and we have a situation of generals without armies until after the Balfour Declaration. But the Zionist idea is, of course, ancient. It begins in Old Testament times, in the Hebrew Bible, with the several returns from captivity, whether in Babylon or in Egypt, back to the Promised Land. And that idea then is eternal. However, efforts, serious political efforts on behalf of the return of the Jews to their homeland in Palestine began in the 1830s and were promoted above all by British Christian evangelicals It's interesting that, that over the last 20 years, this has come to the attention of Israeli and Jewish American scholars more and more. The matter had been ignored largely since Israel was created in 1948. But today, for instance, Professor Anita Shapira in Tel Aviv, who's kind of the doyen of Zionist historians, states in her brilliant synthesis of modern Israeli history, including the 19th century Zionist chapter, that it began with English Protestants who then passed on the idea to Jewish circles. So we have it as an ancient idea, we have it as political effort beginning in the 1830s, but as a movement involving masses, we see its birth not until 1881, 1882 with the Hoveve Zion movement. And I'm sure John Desser will say something about this. His great-grandfather was a Hovev, a lover. That's what the word means, a lover of Zion. However, once again, because of, we might say, intransigence on the part of the Sultan and the Tsar, one not allowing the Jews in, the other not allowing the Jews out, the first Aliyah, which began then with Hoveve Zionism in 1882, the movement once again lost impetus, and we have a situation of generals without armies once again by as soon as the late 1880s, when Herzl appears on the scene with his Der Judenstaat, his Jewish state pamphlet in early 1896. There is this sudden explosion of effort. He was able almost at once to gain the attention of the Grand Duke of Baden, and did so thanks to an Anglican priest, a German-British, the German-British Reverend William Heschler. He organized the Congress, and above all, at the Congress, Herzl was able to establish lasting institutional structures and the very organization of what would become the state. This includes the Jewish company, a Jewish bank as well. So it is appropriate, really, that we think almost in terms of virgin birth, parthenogenesis in the case of Herzlian Zionism. But there is this much earlier chapter, and we need to also remember, as I stressed, that the movement faded out once again in the early part of the 20th century, only to be reborn again once the Balfour Declaration had been issued and the mandate was being created.
Thank you, Philip, and we will come back to the role of Christian Zionism later in the program. But Grégory, you have studied this extensively, and you've spoken both in Basel and in Sanremo, which again was the completion in a way of what happened in Basel, and as you said, Philip then went to through London and not through Berlin as perhaps Theodor Herzl had hoped. Grégory, what is your take on this Big Bang theory?
Are you talking about a series? No, sorry. About this Big Bang theory, I mean, I would say the answer is in a way, obviously, yes. It was that was the Big Bang. But I think it's interesting to try to look into a little bit on what gave that motivation to Herzl. It's as everyone knows today, so Herzl was not the first. There were some called the proto-Zionists, and in the proto-Zionists, they were not only Christian evangelicals or Protestants. They were rabbis, of course. At the beginning of the 19th century, even at the end of the 18th century, you had rabbis who were you could include them in this proto-Zionists. I remember this sentence from Herzl writing to his friend Max Bodenheimer and saying that if he had known what the predecessors had said, he would not even had written anything. He would not have written Der Judenstaat. And if he had been familiar with their literature. And in a way, it's good that he wasn't, because he then decided to do something about it. If he had read all the literature on the subject, then he would have thought that somebody else could have done it in his place, and perhaps we would not be in this situation today. But I like to look at the genesis, as the history of how did this idea came in Herzl's mind. And we all know the bit of the legend about the Dreyfus affair, and how, as being this reporter in Paris for the Neue Freie Presse, where he heard about the trial of Dreyfus, and then he understood that assimilation would never work. And that we needed a Jewish national home, and that there was, in a way, no solution to anti-Semitism, no way of going against, really, of combating really anti-Semitism, and the only real way was to just have a Jewish national home. But and there are, I mean, so some say that he exaggerated a little bit the influence of the Dreyfus affair later on. I don't think he exaggerated that much. I mean, when you look at the accounts or what he wrote, it was just that instead of saying that it was death to Judas, death to a traitor, he then said that in the streets of Paris they were saying death to the Jews, but it's about the same thing. And he understood that then, even if at the beginning he wasn't completely sure if Dreyfus was guilty or not, he actually thought perhaps Dreyfus was guilty, but he thought, even if Dreyfus is guilty, why would just the captain, a Jewish captain, if he was a traitor, why would that include all of the Jewish people? And that's where there was a problem. And he identified that even if Dreyfus was guilty, there was a problem that all the Jews were stigmatized, where it was only one Jewish person. But the other thing that I like to look at, and it's probably because of where I come from, but it's first we need to understand that Herzl was not. I mean, everyone says he was a lawyer. Okay, he studied law, but he just worked in the law department of different universities for a few years, and it wasn't really his thing. That's not what he wanted to do. And he was a man of letters, as one would say in the past, and he would feel much more close to people such as Max Nardau or other writers or men of letters than all the others who were more politicians. I mean, in a way, and he wasn't really much connected to them. And one has to understand that when he was this reporter, this journalist in Paris, he, for this Neue Freie Presse, it wasn't just any newspaper. This was really the interesting newspaper, one of the most interesting newspapers in Europe, in Vienna. And it was really all about literature, theater, plays. That's all it was, culture. Most of the newspaper was about that, and that's why people loved it. It was not centered on things going on at the moment, but really about culture in a broad sense and art. And that was the focus of Herzl when he was in Paris. And I stumbled on something a few years ago, which I understand the gentleman, Chaim Orlan, wrote. I heard a book about it, but I've never found the book, which where he was one of the editors of the how do you say, the proceedings of the First Zionist Congress, actually. And he published in 1997, very late, and he just before dying. But he identified this this thing that was quite interesting in Herzl's life in Paris is that as being this reporter in Paris, he had to go to all the theater plays, attend all the theater performances here and there in Paris. And there was one by this, which had been a play which had been written in 1873 by Alexandre Dumas fils, the son of Alexandre Dumas, the famous French writer. Alexandre Dumas fils is more known for his plays, and his play La Femme de Claude there was a representation in a big theater in Paris in 1894, and in 1994 Herzl was there to write a review on this play, and this play talks about a number of things, but there are two characters in this play called Daniel and Rebecca. They are Jews who want to establish a Jewish national homeland. And Herzl saw this play, and he wrote in the Neue Freie Presse that this was complete utopia, that he didn't like it at all. I mean, people didn't really like that play. It didn't become very popular. It wasn't one of the best of Alexandre Dumas fils, but he thought it was complete utopia. And so, according to this gentleman, Chaim Erlen, there's a good chance that Herzl, just became acquainted with this idea then. And when the Dreyfus affair happened, or also when he saw some anti-Semitism in Austria, then he thought back at this play and at this possibility of a Jewish national homeland.
Thank you, Grégory. And John, before we come over to you and honor and ask questions about your great-grandfather, maybe to give some context to Philip and Grégory, but briefly asking these questions. So who were the typical delegates in Basel? Where did they come from? What were their backgrounds? One small interesting detail, which we discussed before the webinar went live, is that Theodor Herzl was very theatrical, as mentioned before. And for him, this was almost like putting together a play, and it was a black tie event. So I told my panelists that even though this will not be a black tie event, let's at least, be properly dressed for this occasion. But Philip, if we come back to you, how would you describe the delegates who came to Basel? You need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm audible now. Yeah, I think the best way to grasp them succinctly is to say that the various Zionist groups that dated back to the early 1880s jumped on board Herzlian Zionism almost at once. Dr. Lafitte mentioned, for example, Max Bodenheimer. He was one of the leading Zionists from a large group of Zionists in Germany. And the same goes for those in Vienna. In fact, Vienna, beginning in the early 1880s, was the hub in Western Europe of the Zionist idea, outside of Russian lands, outside of Romania. And there, for instance, Peretz Smolensky was writing, and he was publishing a Hebrew language Zionist periodical, Ha-Shachar. And at the university, one of Herzl's colleagues at the law department, Nathan Birnbaum, already in 1883, created together with Moritz Schnierer, someone who also became a close collaborator of Herzl, and Ruben Bierer, they created a unit, a grouping of Hofete Zion called Kadima. And as we know, Kadima means both forward and eastward. And they put out posters to announce the creation of their group throughout the university in Vienna. And these men, who wound up publishing their own newspaper, Selbst Emancipation, which they named after Leon Pinsker's classical work, Auto Emancipation, these men jumped on board Herzlian Zionism at once. In fact, it was as swiftly as in February 1896, just a couple of weeks after Der Judenstaat came out, incidentally on Valentine's Day. It was the 14th of February 1896. These men already organized a meeting with Herzl. Bodenheimer and Wolfson, who later replaced Herzl as the president of the Zionist organization, not yet then called the World Zionist Organization. But those men in Germany, the Zionists in Vienna, those in Romania, including Carpel Lippe, who in fact was the first speaker at the Congress 125 years ago. He was the honorary president, and he meant to be kind of a linchpin connecting the earlier Hofefe Zionism with Herzlian Zionism. So essentially, what we see is a regrouping, a reinvigorating of pre-existing, pre to 1896, pre-existing Zionist organizations.
We kept you waiting. Thank you, Philip. We kept you waiting, John. Again, you have an interesting painting just behind you, and it's not a coincidence. We met in Washington a few months ago, and we had this dinner, and you shared about your family history. And of course, at that time, there was no way of knowing that that family bond you would lose one part just a few days ago. But and you kindly also submitted some information about Mordechai Ben Ami that I've been able to read, and what a fascinating story. But John, tell us about what has been described as the forgotten writer, Mordechai Ben Ami.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Dr. Steele and Dr. Lafitte. Very interesting information that you all both have shared. Yes, behind me is a painting of Mordechai Ben Ami. This hung in my grandmother's apartment in Givatayim near Tel Aviv for the last few decades. And when she passed away, my mother had the painting restored by a professional artist. And when my mother decided to move from Arizona to Hawaii, she sent it to me. And so here it hangs in my study. I was just with my mother a few weeks ago in Honolulu, and we spoke Hebrew together and sang songs in Hebrew that seemed to give her a lot of joy and pleasure. And just before I got on this webinar, Thomas, I think I shared with you that I was meeting with my rabbi, and he said the whole point of mourning is to do things that honor the person, the loved one that you're trying to honor. And so the opportunity to share today about my great-grandfather, and whose name my mother always carried, and which we gave to our son as his middle name, is a great opportunity. So I thank you for that. I want to recommend a professor in Italy named Dr. Laura Salmon, Salmon. She's written extensively about my great-grandfather, and I was just reading last night as I was traveling back to Washington, an article she wrote called Ben Ami's Swiss Experience, the Narrative and the Zionist Dream. And when I read what she wrote about what he wrote about, because I have not read his original works, they're mostly in Russian, though she, I think, has translated a lot of it into Italian, which also does not help me. But when she summarizes what he wrote about, then I start to be able to get into my great-grandfather's head and understand what he was thinking. So he grew up in a shtetl, in a tiny little Jewish community in Russia. His father was killed at a young age, and then he was forced to sort of grow up quickly and became interested, like Dr. Lafitte said, about Theodor Herzl and letters and the academy, and he started writing and learning at a university in Odessa. A lot of these early Zionists, they started to see or experience some anti-Semitism, and it started their creative juices flowing to think about, well, what could be a solution? And in my great-grandfather's case, he would work this out in short stories. And so he would write short stories about families or people. And in each case, as Dr. Salmon points out, there's this idyllic life and an ideal of the shtetl, which represents Zion. It represents a Jewish homeland. It represents things that are pure and spiritual. And then there's Rome, or the city, or what he would call assimilation. And those are the two options, it seems like many Jewish writers thought they had at that time. Were they going to just assimilate into the city? And in my great-grandfather's case, that would be Switzerland. He used to go to Switzerland from time to time, where he would see or even Odessa, where he would see the calamity and the busyness of Gentile life in the city, versus this ideal he had in his head of the shtetl and a homeland for the Jews. And in a lot of his writing, apparently, he has this juxtaposition. The one reprieve, by the way, that Dr. Salmon points out is God's creation. He talks about the beauty of the Swiss Alps and how that would give him a moment of refuge from this dichotomy and this choice that he constantly was feeling between the Zionist ideal and real life, and whether to truly assimilate. But it's been fascinating to me to learn a little bit more about him and about his role. Apparently, he came to the Zionist Congress a couple weeks early and met with Theodor Herzl and offered to help with some of the organization of it. And he wrote about his time at the First Zionist Congress and in published articles about what he experienced there. So it's a great honor to be with you today and to have this discussion.
Thank you, John. And if I may, this is part of the book that you mentioned. This is Isaac Babel writing about Jewish life in Switzerland. So if you allow me, I will quote. It's a question, but didn't God himself make a mistake when he settled the Jews in Russia, so they could be tormented as if they were in hell? Would it not have been better to have the Jews living in Switzerland, where they would be surrounded by first-class lakes, mountain air, and Frenchmen galore? Everyone makes mistakes, even God. This is Isaac Babel from How Things Were Done in Odessa. Having Grégory Lafitte with us in Geneva, I thought we would bring that into the program. Grégory, I could add from what I saw, and we've spoken about it before, that it wasn't just the natural beauty in Switzerland. Mordechai Ben Ami did also experience two things. He said there was a great deal of anti-Semitism, and the Jews in Switzerland were emancipated and very nervous to reveal their Jewish identity. This is out of script, but Grégory, do you have any comments on those observations?
Yes, well, anti-Semitism in Switzerland is a taboo subject in a way. It's always this question of thinking that it was only the neighbors who were anti-Semites and not really the Swiss. What you say, I mean, your question just makes me think of something that is not that well known about some anti-Semitic attacks during World War II in Switzerland, where this anti-Semitism, which no one wanted to see and thought it was only in Germany or in France or elsewhere, but it wasn't really in Switzerland. Suddenly, it became clear to everyone that that anti-Semitism was not only the thing of some extreme haters in some parts of Switzerland, but it was even in part of the rural the countryside of Switzerland, where this anti-Semitism was a big thing. And I'm talking here about this atrocious killing of a farmer in a Jewish. I mean, he was selling cattle and he was killed in a terrible way during the 1942, and then people started realizing, oh yes, okay, you know, it's a real thing. It's part of our almost the some of the thinking in some of the rural parts of Switzerland. We don't have time to go much into the subject, but it's just it's something that I think is still taboo. And as I'm sure you all know, there was the Swiss government in the beginning of the years 2000 thought, let's finally look back at our history and try to understand was there any anti-Semitism, and they put together a report called the Rapport Bergier, and but it was terrible. The whole report was saying all of the anti-Semitism that we could find in Switzerland, and not only you know, at the beginning of the 20th century, but even, you know, at many other times.
Let us conclude that part by also saying that, as far as I know, Mordechai Ben Ami left for Palestine around 1924, and he's buried in Tel Aviv. So peace over his memory as well. Christian Zionism, Philip, you mentioned this subject in your introductory remarks, and you have written extensively about it. One of the questions, and I think also that that issue is not so much taboo anymore. We have a former prime minister who often have pointed out, he would say that you Christians, you were the first Zionist, although Grégory would say, well, there is this next year in Jerusalem, so that's not necessarily a Christian quote, but nevertheless. But two questions. I mean, what can you say about the role of Christians at Basel at the time, and the significance? You need to unmute yourself again.
Okay, I'm unmuted, I believe.
Yeah.
Among Herzl's most glaring failings was, in fact, the way he remained aloof toward religious sentiment and religiosity at large. That regards both fellow Jews. He tended to disdain pious Jews his whole life, and struggled with that sort of disdain even after his conversion in 1895. And the same goes towards Christians. He was like a lot of people we all know, urbane, sophisticated, educated people who like to keep religious sentiments and religious thoughts, those of the people around them, at bay and at a distance. So he felt as if he were, you know, wonderfully tolerant in dismissing the eccentricities, for instance, of the Reverend William Heschler. And he kept himself oblivious to the religious sentiments of Frederick I, the Grand Duke of Baden. Let me repeat that just 2 months after Der Judenstaat came out, Herzl met with the Grand Duke, thanks to Reverend Heschler. And a very interesting thing happened. It wasn't until 1961 that a book by a man and wife of the last name Ellen came out. And Alex Bein wrote the introduction to it. Alex Bein wrote the first magisterial biography of Herzl. It's very worth reading to this day. It was written in the late 1930s. But in the 1961 edition to this book by the Ellens, a book that shows the correspondence between Heschler and the Grand Duke Frederick. It also has correspondence from the Kaiser, Wilhelm II. Bain talks about a revelation that this is utterly astounding what we're reading. This is entirely new material. We had no idea, you know, that the religious aspect was foremost in the mind of the Grand Duke, as well as, for different reasons, in the mind of the Kaiser. And Herzl knew nothing about this because, you know, the urbane, sophisticated man kept such things at bay. Herzl could speak almost, we'd have to say, venomously about his own fellow pious Jews. And he did soften his stance toward them after his conversion. We see this, for instance, in the way his grandfather, Simon Herzl, appeared to him apparition-like at a certain messianic moment. Already in 1896, in the summer of 1896, Herzl was on his way by train to meet the Sultan. To cut a long story short, that meeting never came ahead. But while he was passing through the Balkans at one train station after another, there were throngs of people. And the expectation was that Herzl really would win the long coveted Firman, right? The permission of the Sultan for Jewish colonization. And Herzl, caught up in this messianic mood, looks out at the crowd, and for the first time ever in anything we know, and mind you, he left 1,600 pages of diaries. There are more than 6,000 letters we have that he wrote. He never mentioned his grandfather, Simon Herzl, who was a pious Jew, a messianic Jew, in the sense that he believed that he was living in messianic times, that the Messiah was about to return. He didn't pass away until Theodor was 19, and he was a regular presence in Theodor's young life. But it was only then, during this messianic moment at the train station, that Herzl looked out and said, "Oh, and there was a man in a fur cap who looked just like my grandfather Simon." There were several Christian Zionists at the Congress, and on the third day, in his final comments, Herzl thanked them, calling them, mind you, Christian Zionists. It seems that he himself coined that term. He used it once somewhat earlier. It was in September, actually, of 1896. He used that same term about Baron Manteuffel. This was a German or German-Austrian Christian who, in the Tyrolls, was running a farm where he was trying to teach young Jewish men how to cultivate and prepare them for farming in Palestine. That was the idea. But at the Congress then, he thanked the Christian Zionists, beginning with Henri Dunant by name. Dunant was, in fact, not present. He was suffering ill health in Switzerland, Haydn, Switzerland. But he also thanked, of course, Reverend Heschler. He thanked Baron Manteuffel again, and did so before he got around to thanking the Jewish Zionists who had preceded him. And in fact, he didn't even list any names here. He didn't mention David Gordon, the editor-in-chief of Hamagi, the greatest and most important Zionist Hebrew language newspaper, News Weekly. He didn't mention Smolenskin or Rabbi Mohilever, but he did mention these Christians by name.
Thank you, Philip. And before we go into the last final chapter of the webinar, John, is there anything? I mean, you are with the painting behind you. What are your thoughts of Christians who take on this Jewish cause? We've spoken about this over the years, and I'm always touched by hearing your observations.
Well, as you know, I see it as absolutely critical. The Jewish people cannot stand for themselves and by themselves. And I think the greatest example of that is the work that you've been called to, Thomas, and your conviction about the Evian Conference in 1936 or 7, whenever that was, when leaders of Europe knew what was happening in Germany and understood Hitler's objectives, but no one spoke up. And I think you made it your life's calling to make sure, quote, that never happens again. And it's crucial. It's fascinating to learn from Dr. Steele how this was present from the very beginning, and that serious Christians who have understood the role of the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have played throughout history and the foundation of Christendom itself, and the eventual return of Messiah, or as we Jews think of it, maybe his first visit. Shimon Peres always eloquently said that the Christians, when Messiah finally comes, we'll find out whether it's his first visit or his second. But the point is, we both believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we believe in a promised Messiah. This was a promise given to Abraham in Genesis, that through his offspring, all nations would be blessed. And I believe that is a direct prophecy about Messiah. So for Christians who believe in Messiah, believe he's been here once already, to take up this cause, to ensure that those who are the root, the main root of the tree, as St. Paul referred to it, and Christians are the wild offshoots, are protected and in a homeland where they can be safe, secure, and practice their religion as they know it, is crucial. And I'm reminded actually of a quote that my great-grandfather said after being at Basel, and he had sort of a messianic feeling about Herzl's speech, and he wrote later in an article, quote, "But what is this? This is not the same Herzl whom I had seen to this point, whom I had just seen late the previous evening. Before us there appeared a wondrous, splendid, regal figure. It seemed that the great 2,000-year dream of our people had come true, that before us stands the Messiah of the house of David." So I think my great-grandfather may be the only person on the planet who thought Theodor Herzl might have been Messiah. But the point is, people who think about Messiah and care about Messiah care about the Jewish people. And you've demonstrated that more than anybody in modern times. And I admire you, and I'm humbled to be in your presence. And I wish more Christian Zionists would stand up the way that you do.
Thank you, John. And we better stop you there before we get embarrassed, but I know you mean it from the bottom of your heart. And we take this as a greeting from Mordechai Ben Ami as well. So thank you. Gregory, coming into the final part of the webinar, you spoke already 5 years ago when we hosted the 120th anniversary dinner in Basel. This might be a good opportunity to summarize what you said, and maybe you have added something in the meantime. We won't have the full hour you had in Basel, but if you are able to summarize briefly, and then we can come to a close.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Thomas. Yes, I promise I'm not going to take an hour and 20 minutes like I did in Basel 5 years ago. But my speech started by talking about this the address of Herzl at the First Zionist Congress, where Herzl recognized that what was important is really not only the return to Zion physically, but the return to Judaism, and for the Jews to stop this assimilation and really understand what it means to be Jewish and come back to it. And I quoted quite a lot in my speech Leo Strauss, who said that political Zionism has to be based on culture. And so it was a lot about the Jewish culture. And why did I talk about this? Is that when we see this assimilation, it's really becoming like everybody else, and so it's really somehow becoming Greek instead of being Jewish. And so I try to explain what was this dream of Herzl by showing the differences and similarities, but mostly differences between the Jewish culture and the Greek culture, and how it is important to really understand that it's not only a question of anti-Semitism. It was really a question of really the Jewish people finding again their identity and knowing who they are. And I pointed out that today we recognize the contributions of the Greek culture, of the Greek civilization to humanity. We think that our Western civilizations are really were born out of this Greek source, and but we never really recognize our debt to the Jewish people and to the Jewish culture. As Jacques Attali has said a number of times, perhaps the reason is that the Greek civilization, the great Greek civilization, is not here anymore, but the Jews are still here. So it's a little bit hard to recognize our debt to a people who is still here and living among us. So I try to point out the importance for the international community to recognize its Jewish roots in a way, and this is in a way our work at the United Nations with the Forum for Cultural Diplomacy to really see what are the contributions of Jewish culture to humanity, and that the Jewish culture has often run the risk of being assimilated into the Greek culture. And that we need to recognize what is this Jewish heritage. And I ended really if I want to really summarize, I would say that Zionism is something more than the recreation of the Jewish state. And it's really quoting in a way Herzl, who's explained that it's the essence of Zionism is an infinite ideal. So by pointing the differences between the Greek source and the Jewish source, we realize the Greek thinking centers, everything is centered around the finite and tragic reason. And the Jewish culture brings something very different, which is it centers around the infinite, and I won't enter more into that, and hope. And that's where the difference is, and we can see it in many aspects. And one that I really like to emphasize is that when Greek gods are in the image of man, in Jewish culture, man is created in the image of God. And there you see the big difference of thinking between the Jewish and the Greek culture. And so whilst Jewish culture has been neglected in the past, it's now time for the world, and it was time 5 years ago, it's still time today for the world to recognize its significance. And I closed my speech by saying that in a way, we could say that the Zionist vision has not been fully completed, and that Herzl's dream, even what he said in his first Congress address, is still valid today, and we still haven't really seen totally this being fulfilled. And that the state of Israel, yes, it has been recreated, but the Jews no longer have to find solace in the false solution of assimilation. But the vision still needs to be so fulfilled, not anymore at the individual level, at the just one, for one Jew level, but at the level of the state. Meaning that the state of Israel should not be forced to be just any assimilated state in the world, but like any other state, but it should be recognized for what it is, fully play its role as being a light to the nations, as being the Jewish state.
Thank you, Grégory. And we will have to reprint that speech. We'll give you some time to edit, and but that was beautiful, and we all have wonderful recollections of that evening. 1 minute each, with a question that could be our next webinar. But the significance of Zionism today in a world where nationalism is de-emphasized, there are no borders, we are focusing on supranationalism. What is the significance, the relevance of Zionism today? Let's start with John, who is always ready.
Ready, but maybe with the wrong answer. I do want to say one thing that I was just thinking about as I was entering this time of mourning. There's a tradition that we say Kaddish for 7 days. Kaddish is a statement of the greatness of God, and we're praising God even in this moment of great sorrow. But the point is, you have to do it in front of 10 people, because making the statement of praise alone in a room doesn't mean anything. And as I was thinking about this earlier, it occurred to me the importance of the Zionist Congress in 1897 was that Herzl said it in front of a couple hundred people. And if he had just said it to himself in a room, nobody would remember it, and he would not have founded the Jewish state like he thought he did upon reflecting on it a few days later. And so, but what is the role of Zionism today? I might defer and allow the two PhDs to answer that. I'm a lowly bachelor's degree in international affairs. It's hard for me to even comprehend that question, but I'm very curious to hear what Dr. Lafitte and Dr. Steele say.
I think you said it very well yourself. So I'll give you a 9.5 out of 10. So don't be shy. But if we come back to Grégory Lafitte, unmute.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. I would say that I mean I don't have the answer. I think John's answer was actually better than any answer I could give. So I can give you my PhD if you want, John. But but I'm not sure I need it really, so I can give it to you. But you know, when you ask this question, well, first, you know, that's how I ended my speech in Basel 5 years ago, meaning that it's not completed Zionism, but Zionism, I believe, is a hope for every nation, for every people group, and in a way that's what Herzl said himself at the end of his address in the First Zionist Congress, saying that we are to live at last as free men on our soil and die peacefully in our own homeland. But then he said, the world will be freed by our freedom, enriched by our riches, and made greater by our greatness. And then he added, and whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity. And so Zionism is I think is a great hope. And unfortunately, it has been used as a bad word almost by some, presenting it as something racist or colonialist, and it was completely the opposite. And this, I think it's very important for us to be able to give this message that Zionism is a hope, not only for the Jewish people, but really for all of humanity.
Thank you, and Grégory, I think your previous answer was already an answer in itself, so we could have almost passed you, but thank you for adding. Philip.
I would like to say that when we look back over the last 140 years, back to the birth of the first Zionist movement, Hovete Zionism, and look all the way to today, we see a certain pattern. That is that Zionism made its leaps forward in partnership with Christian Zionists, evangelical Christians in particular. And when Zionism failed, or was stillborn, as happened many times, it had to do with the fact that the opportunity had been missed to partner with Christians. That is, Christian Zionism reached a kind of a crescendo in the 1840s and 1850s, at a time when it hadn't really caught on at all among the Jews. Rabbi Kalisha from here in Poland, from the city of Torun, published his fundamental religious Zionist work not until 1862. I'd also stress that his work was entirely positive. That is, he was expecting redemption, geula, that the Messianic age was dawning. He wasn't calling for a recreation of a Jewish state in Palestine out of fear, out of anti-Semitism, fearing assimilation even. That yet hadn't taken place. But later too, we see that at the Congress, the United States hadn't yet become the partner to Jewish Zionists that it did later, and Christian Zionism in Britain was waning drastically already in the 1890s, such that when the Congress happened, the British weren't really there. It turned out in the end that Balfour, for instance, was kind of an old school evangelical Christian. And when he became prime minister in 1902 and later was the minister for foreign affairs during World War I, it wasn't till this time that, as a kind of a fluke, really, that without broad societal support among the British that were the leaders in that government during following Aquist's government, that of David Lloyd George, that the Zionist movement could be propelled once again ahead. Lloyd George and Balfour being very strong Christian Zionists. Much the same took place in 1948. After all, George Marshall, who had a huge distance towards Jews at large, threatened to resign if Truman was to recognize the Jewish state, which he did within 6 minutes, being a Baptist. Truman was a man who read the Bible all the time. His closest partner was Eddie Jacobson in the haberdashery company they had in Missouri. So when we see these moments where Zionism met its successes and took steps forward, it's nearly always when it's done so in partnership with Christian Zionists. So that's something that needs to be maintained, the partnership between Jewish Zionists and us Christian Zionists.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Grégory, and thank you, John. It has been a fascinating, almost 1 hour mentioning the relationship between Christians and Jews. I just had a blog text published earlier today in the Times of Israel that I can take this last minute to promote, which also brings up this crucial and important critical relationship between Christians and Jews, to say that there is still this divide, and as true believers, we have to fully embrace the Zionist idea and the Jewish state. This has been, we will end with a quote, but before ending, so Grégory, you get the last word with a quote, and you will give the source in just a minute. But this has been a webinar again by the European Coalition for Israel. And we look forward to keeping in contact with you over newsletters and social media, and hopefully also through a webinar here in the near future. If you find these activities interesting and rewarding, please feel free also to go to our website and subscribe. And there's a donate button for those who are inclined to support in that way. But thank you again, and a special thank you again to John, and we continue to mourn with you, but also celebrate the rich legacy of Mordechai Ben Ami, which so well illustrate the theme of this webinar, the First Zionist Congress 125 years ago. Let us conclude in a way that I think Theodor Herzl would have appreciated, with some culture and with a quote. Grégory, you will let us know what book you are quoting and who you are quoting. So over to you just for the last word.
Thank you, Thomas. I will read an excerpt of the novel of Herzl, Alt Neuland. We need to remember that Herzl wanted to write a novel from the beginning. It's just that he didn't think he had enough time, and so he wrote this pamphlet, but he never wanted to write a pamphlet. He wanted to write a novel. So that's what he did with the rest of his life, just before he finished it 2 years before dying. And so I will read now this excerpt, but just for you so you understand the story, what it talks about. The novel tells the story of Friedrich Löwenberg, who is a young Jewish Viennese intellectual, and who, because he's tired with European decadence, joins an Americanized Prussian aristocrat named Kingscourt as they retire to a remote Pacific island in 1902, so when he published the book. They stop in Jaffa on their way to the Pacific, and they find Palestine a backward, destitute, and sparsely populated land. And exactly what Herzl saw in 1898 when he visited. Löwenberg and Kingscourt spent 20 years on the island, cut off from all civilization, and they stop over in Palestine on their way back to Europe in 1923. And they are astonished to discover land drastically transformed. And so this is what Herzl describes in this novel, is with this Jewish organization called the New Society. The European Jews rediscover and inhabit their Alt-Neu land, reclaiming their own destiny in the land of Israel. And this is the novel from which comes the expression, if you will it, it is no dream. So let me read it to you. This is in the book 1, section 6. Kingscourt and Friedrich spent several days in the old land of the Jews. Jaffa, a very unpleasant impression, made a very unpleasant impression upon them. Though nobly situated on the blue Mediterranean, the town was in a state of extreme decay. Landing was difficult in the forsaken harbor. The alleys were dirty, neglected, full of vile odors. Everywhere, misery in bright oriental rags. Poor Turks, dirty Arabs, timid Jews lounged about, indolent, beggarly, hopeless. A peculiar tomb-like odor of mold caught one's breath. They hurried away from Jaffa and went up to Jerusalem on the miserable railway. The landscape through which they passed was a picture of desolation. The lowlands were mostly sand and swamp. The lean fields looked as if burnt over. The inhabitants of the blackish Arab villages looked like brigands. Naked children played in the dirty alleys. Over the distant horizon loomed the deforested hills of Judea. The bare slopes and the bleak rocky valleys showed few traces of present or former cultivation. If this is our land, remarked Friedrich sadly, it has declined like our people. Yes, it's pretty bad, agreed Kingscourt. But much could be done here with afforestation. If 500,000 young giant cedars were planted, they shoot up like asparagus. This country needs nothing but water and shade to have a very great future. And who is to bring water and shade here? The Jews. And Kingscourt swore a great cavalry oath. It was night when they reached Jerusalem, a marvelous white moonlit night. Donnerwetter, shouted Kingscourt. I say, this is beautiful. He stopped the cab, which was taking them from the station to a hotel, and called to the guide. You stay here and tell that camel of a driver to follow us slowly. Let's walk a bit, shall we, Dr. Löwenberg? Again, turning to the guide, the old man asked, what's the name of this region? The Valley of Jehoshaphat, sir, replied the man meekly. Then it's a real place. Devil take me, the Valley of Jehoshaphat? I thought it was just something in the Bible. Here our Lord and Savior walked. What do you think of it, Dr. Löwenberg? Ah, yes. Still, it must mean something to you also. These ancient walls, this valley. Jerusalem, cried Friedrich in a half whisper, his voice trembling. He did not understand why the sight of this strange city affected him so powerfully. Was it the memory of words heard in early childhood, in passages of prayer murmured by his father? Memories of Seder services of long forgotten years stirred in him? One of the few Hebrew phrases he still knew rang in his ears. Leshana haba beYerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. Suddenly he saw himself a little boy going to synagogue with his father. Ah, but faith was dead now. Youth was dead. His father was dead. And here before him, the walls of Jerusalem towered in the fairy moonlight. His eyes overflowed. He stopped short, and the hot tears coursed slowly down his cheeks.
And we wish everyone a happy 125th anniversary. Until the next time.